He stood quietly in the dealership lobby while every employee walked right past him, as if he didn't exist. Minutes later, a white man walked in and got offered coffee, a private tour, and the manager's full attention. No one had a clue. The black man they told to wait outside owned the entire company. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. It was a chilly Monday morning when Marcus D. Hayes parked his car a block away from the dealership. He didn't want anyone seeing him pull up in that vehicle, not because he was hiding, but because the car itself spoke volumes. Sleek lines, matte steel finish, silent engine. It wasn't just any luxury car. It was a one-of-a-kind concept model designed exclusively for Hayes Motors. Only 3 of them existed in the world, and Marcus owned the first. He stepped out dressed in jeans and an old tan windbreaker. Nothing about him screamed money or authority. No briefcase, no entourage, just a man with salt and pepper hair and soft leather shoes that had seen better days. He adjusted his cap, took a breath, and headed toward the dealership entrance. Marcus had done this more times than his staff knew. Disguised visits kept his judgment sharp and his people honest. He believed a business only worked if it respected everyone walking through the door, not just those flashing a Rolex or wearing tailored suits. As he walked into the lobby, he glanced around. The space was polished, white marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass panels, and shiny black SUVs lined up like statues. But something else hit him right away. The way the 2 salesmen at the counter looked up, hesitated, and went back to chatting as if he weren't even there. He approached slowly, giving them time to notice him. One of them, a tall guy with slicked-back blonde hair, raised his brows and muttered something under his breath to his colleague, who smirked. Neither greeted him. No, good morning. No, can I help you? Marcus cleared his throat politely. Excuse me, I'm interested in the LX7 hybrid. Is anyone available to? The taller one held up a finger without even making eye contact. You'll need to wait outside. Sir, one of our reps will be with you when we're done. Outside? Marcus blinked. Before he could say another word, a young white man in a navy blazer walked in behind him. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. The 2 salesmen straightened up, put on their brightest smiles, and greeted the man like royalty. Welcome to Hayes Motors, sir, one said warmly. Can I get you a coffee while we bring the manager? Marcus stepped aside, watching the scene play out like a bad rerun. His hands rested calmly in his jacket pockets, but his mind was ticking. He looked to his right and noticed a younger employee, Latino, early 20s, standing awkwardly near the back counter. Their eyes met. The kid, Eric, gave a nervous smile and took a step forward as if to intervene. But before he could say anything, the taller salesman glanced over his shoulder. Eric, go help in the service bay. Would you? Eric hesitated, nodded quickly, and walked away, glancing once more at Marcus with a flicker of regret. Marcus said nothing. He simply turned around and stepped out through the glass doors. The cold air hit his face. He didn't feel angry, not yet, more disappointed than anything else. The kind of disappointment that settled deep in the chest. He'd built this place from nothing. And this was how his staff treated someone they assumed had no money? No status? He strolled slowly back to his car. As he neared the driver's side, he heard a voice, quiet, amused, coming from behind the showroom's glass. Look at the car he came in. Probably borrowed it from someone. Marcus paused for a second, resting his hand on the door handle. He smiled to himself, not out of humor, but out of something heavier, sadder. That car, the one they dismissed so casually, had his initials etched into the steering wheel. As he got in and drove away, he didn't look back, but he knew exactly what his next visit would be, and this time, he wouldn't be coming alone. Marcus didn't sleep much that night. He spent most of it pacing his living room, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and staring out into the dark. The more he replayed the dealership visit in his mind, the clearer it became. It wasn't just 1 or 2 bad apples. Something deeper was rotting in the system. At precisely 7:45 the next morning, he stepped into his office at Hayes Motors headquarters, a minimalist space with warm walnut panels and clean lines. He set down his coat, looked at his assistant, and said plainly, "Call legal and internal security. I need a full pull of surveillance footage from the Riverside branch. Audio included." His tone left no room for hesitation. The assistant blinked, startled, then quickly picked up the phone. "And keep this quiet," Marcus added without looking up. "No alerts to the branch. No questions asked." Within the hour, 3 people were seated in his office: the corporate attorney, the security director, and his chief of hour. All wore the same look, curiosity laced with discomfort. "We're reviewing guest service protocols," Marcus said calmly. "Start with yesterday's recordings. I want full context, no clips, no edits." The attorney shifted in her seat. "Marcus, may I ask why the secrecy?" He looked at her, his face steady but distant. "Because sometimes people only show their true colors when they think no one's watching." Across town, the Riverside dealership was humming along like any other day. Tom Renner, the branch manager, had just finished his morning espresso when he called the staff into the main showroom for the daily stand-up. Dressed in his usual pressed slacks and blazer, Tom carried himself with the kind of practiced authority that came from years in the business, and from knowing which buttons to push. "Let's be sharp today," he said, clicking through slides on the digital board behind him. "Remember, we prioritize high-impact clients. Image matters. We're not running a charity lot here." A few heads nodded automatically. 1 or 2 employees scribbled notes. But Eric, standing near the back with a clipboard in hand, didn't move. His thoughts were elsewhere. That man from yesterday, Marcus, he couldn't shake the memory of how they'd treated him. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was something heavier, and Eric had stood there, saying nothing. Tom caught his eye. "Eric, everything good?" "Yes, sir," he replied quickly, eyes down. Tom moved on, oblivious or simply uninterested. Eric turned his attention to his tablet. Quietly, he pulled up the customer feedback archive. He typed in a few keywords: discrimination, ignored, race, and up popped several flagged entries, most marked as resolved. One in particular caught his eye. A customer complaint from 2 months ago. Similar tone, same branch, closed without action. That wasn't procedure, not officially. Back at headquarters, Marcus sat in a darkened conference room, watching split-screen footage from 2 different angles. One camera captured his entrance. The other caught the sales team turning away, the warm greeting offered to the next customer, and the quiet dismissal sent his way. No one looked surprised. No one stepped in. His jaw tightened. Later that afternoon, Marcus placed a private call to a friend, Ronnie Butler, a former colleague turned diversity consultant who occasionally helped Marcus vet corporate culture. Ronnie was black, sharp, and understood exactly what Marcus needed without having to be told. "I need someone to visit that same dealership tomorrow," Marcus said. "Don't dress up, just be yourself, and wear a wire." Ronnie chuckled, but it wasn't a laugh. "I assume you want honesty served cold?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Exactly." The next day, Ronnie did just that. He entered the showroom around noon. Jeans, hoodie, calm demeanor. He asked to test drive a mid-tier model and was told none were available. When he asked for a brochure, the representative shrugged and pointed at the door. The entire interaction lasted less than 5 minutes, but the audio lasted forever. By the end of the day, the recording was on Marcus's desk. It wasn't just bad service. It was open disregard. There were snide remarks about people wasting time and window shoppers who never buy. And one phrase, spoken just loud enough for the mic to catch, made Marcus lean back in his chair. "They always come in thinking they can afford something here." The mask was off. And this time, Marcus wasn't just disappointed. He was done waiting. Marcus sat alone in the conference room, eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long streaks of light across the table. But the room felt colder than it should have. For hours, he had watched the footage, first his own visit, then the undercover recording Ronnie had brought back. The videos were different in timing, in setting, in tone, but they shared something worse than carelessness. They shared intent. He leaned back slowly, fingers interlocked across his stomach, his expression unreadable. On the surface, he was calm, always calm. But behind those steady eyes was a flood of disappointment. Not just in the staff who failed a customer. In himself. For letting this culture take root under his watch. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the city skyline. Then, without turning back, he spoke. Pull every file you have on the Riverside team. I want every internal complaint, customer review, and staff evaluation from the past 2 years. No filters. His voice startled the assistant still seated at the far end of the room. She nodded, typed quickly, and left the room. An hour later, the files started to arrive. Digital reports, performance logs, copies of customer surveys marked as addressed. Some were flagged with high concern, mostly from clients with non-Anglo names. Marcus noticed, and then there was Tom Renner. The manager of that location had glowing remarks about sales quotas. Numbers were always solid, but Marcus noticed something buried in the complaint archives. 3 separate entries involving Tom and guests who felt unwelcome or disrespected. All 3 complaints came from Black or Latino customers, and all 3 were closed without formal review. Marcus rubbed the bridge of his nose. He'd seen this before. He just never expected it to happen in his own company, under a man he once trusted to lead a branch. He picked up his phone and scrolled through contacts until he reached one labeled Yvonne C. With a quick tap, he hit dial. Yvonne Clark answered after 2 rings. Her voice warm but firm. Even retired, she still had the tone of someone who didn't tolerate nonsense. Well, I figured this call would come eventually, she said before he could speak. Marcus let out a tired chuckle. You always did see around corners. I saw enough before I left. What's happening over there, Marcus? He explained what he'd found, what he'd experienced. Yvonne listened silently, then responded with something that landed heavier than anything on those tapes. This isn't new, Marcus. It was there when I was running Riverside. It's just, folks learned how to dress it up. You know why I left? Because I kept getting told to focus on sales and let HR handle the culture stuff. But culture is the business. You know that. Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I didn't want to believe it ran this deep. Yvonne's voice softened. Then believe it now, and don't just fire a few people. Change the ground they're standing on. At the dealership, Eric sat at his desk, trying to focus on routine paperwork. But the air felt off. Tense, like everyone was tiptoeing through the day. He had spent his lunch break combing through archived emails, trying to find something, anything, that showed someone had tried to raise concerns before. And he found them, not many, but enough to draw a pattern. Feedback from guests of color who said they felt invisible or ignored. Some of those emails had been labeled low priority. Others, never even opened. The strangest part was that he couldn't find his own message from the day before. He knew he'd drafted something. He'd clicked send, but it wasn't in the system. He frowned and reopened the company portal. When he tried to log into his email, an alert popped up. Access denied. Contact administrator. His pulse quickened. He tried again. Same result. Within seconds, his phone vibrated with a company message, due to a violation of internal protocol. Your account access has been temporarily restricted pending review. Eric sat still for a long moment. The room was suddenly too quiet. The hum of printers, the chatter of coworkers, it all faded. A cold realization crept over him. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen what he was digging through. And someone didn't want him digging anymore. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the room. No one looked directly at him. But he had the strangest sense that someone was watching. The walls, once familiar, now felt like they were closing in. And in that moment, Eric understood something he hadn't fully grasped until now. This wasn't just about bad behavior or poor training. There were people in this building protecting something. And they'd just marked him as a threat. The morning air was crisp and quiet when Marcus stepped out of the black sedan. His shoes clicked against the pavement with a calm, deliberate rhythm. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, and a tie so dark it almost blended into his jacket. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere before word was spoken. Behind him walked his executive assistant, clipboard in hand, and 2 private security officers stationed just far enough to remain discreet but visible. Inside the dealership, the front desk staff froze as the glass doors parted. One of them, the same tall man who'd ignored him just 2 days earlier, opened his mouth as if to greet a stranger. But then his face changed. Recognition hit like a cold slap. The others soon followed. Conversations halted. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Phones stayed off the hook. From his office upstairs, Tom Renner watched the live camera feed with growing panic. He slammed his coffee down, muttered a curse, and yanked on his blazer. By the time he made it downstairs, Marcus was already standing in the middle of the showroom, his expression unreadable, his eyes sweeping the room like a quiet storm. "Mr. Hayes," Tom began, moving toward him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This is unexpected. If I had known, we would have." Marcus didn't return the handshake Tom offered. He glanced at his assistant, who gave a small nod and started handing out printed memos. "Gather your entire staff," Marcus said, his voice calm but cutting through the silence like glass. "Conference room. 30 minutes. Tom blinked. "Is there something wrong?" Marcus didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Tom standing in the middle of his showroom like a man who had just been told the building was on fire. In a small office off the hallway, Marcus sat across from Eric, who looked more like a student called to the principal's office than a car salesman. His tie was crooked, his hands in his lap, his eyes flickering toward the closed blinds. "You tried to speak," Marcus said evenly, "but you didn't." "Why?" Eric swallowed hard. "I wanted to. I've seen what happens when people step out of line here." Marcus tilted his head. "What have you seen?" Eric hesitated, then leaned forward. "A guy named Reggie. A year ago, he told upper management about Tom making racist remarks. Said it in a private meeting. A week later, Reggie got written up for performance issues, and then he was gone. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew. After that, we kept our heads down." Marcus sat back in his chair, nodding slowly, as if a part of him already knew what he was hearing but needed to hear it anyway. "You're not the only one who saw," he said, "but you're the only one I saw hesitate." Eric looked at him, unsure if that was praise or warning. Maybe it was both. 30 minutes later, the entire staff stood shoulder to shoulder in the dealership's largest conference room. The walls were lined with glossy posters of smiling families and luxury sedans. Now, the air inside was thick with unease. Marcus stood at the front of the room. The lights dimmed. A screen behind him came to life with time-stamped footage. No narration, no editing, just the truth. The first clip showed Marcus entering the showroom in his plain clothes, standing unacknowledged while the salesman fawned over a well-dressed white customer. The second showed Ronnie Butler being brushed off, mocked, and ignored. When the screen went dark, silence followed. Some employees stared at the floor. Others blinked back tears. A woman in the corner quietly excused herself. No one moved to defend what they'd seen. Not one voice dared to speak. Marcus looked at them all, letting the silence stretch. Then he said, "This isn't a training issue. This is a culture issue. And it ends today." Tom stood rigid, his face pale. "With all due respect," he said, his voice brittle, "I was following policy. We were told to protect the brand, to focus on client profiles that matched our target demo. That wasn't my invention." Marcus turned to face him. "Are you saying you were ordered to discriminate?" Tom nodded slowly, pulling a folder from under the table. "I have the internal directives, sent from corporate 6 months ago. They use coded language, but it's there, and I wasn't the only manager told to follow them." The room held its breath. What Tom had just dropped wasn't a defense. It was a fuse. The folder Tom handed over felt heavier than it looked. Marcus opened it slowly, flipping past the cover page until his eyes landed on the words that made his jaw clench. Internal Sales Alignment Document, Client Engagement Guidelines. It was dressed in polished language, full of corporate phrasing and vague criteria. Evaluate customer viability based on attire, posture, speech patterns, and presentation. No mention of race, no open prejudice, but anyone reading between the lines could see it clear as day. It was a manual for judgment by appearance. Marcus scanned further. There it was, an electronic signature at the bottom of page 3. William Dresner. His chest tightened. That name brought with it a complicated flood of history. William wasn't just a colleague. He was the man who co-founded Hayes Motors with Marcus 22 years ago, when both had more dreams than gray hair. William had been the strategist, the numbers man, the one who pushed for expansion while Marcus focused on ethics, brand, and community. Over the years, their paths diverged, but Marcus had never imagined betrayal. He remembered a conversation they'd had during a board retreat 3 years back. William had sipped his whiskey, leaned in, and said, "We've got to stop over-policing the sales floors. Let the market sort itself out." At the time, it felt like business talk. Now, those words echoed with something else: permission. Permission to overlook, to exclude, to push aside quietly under the guise of efficiency. Marcus dropped the file on the table and stared at it as if it might change on its own. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room already felt 10 degrees colder. Tom stepped back, hands tucked behind him, as if ready for whatever would come next. But Marcus wasn't looking at Tom anymore. His mind was somewhere else, racing through contracts, board meetings, and email threads, wondering what else had slipped under his radar. Later that day, things began to move faster than anyone anticipated. An anonymous video surfaced online. Grainy, but unmistakable. It was footage from the first day Marcus had visited the Riverside dealership incognito. The clip showed him standing alone near the reception desk. Ignored. Moments later, it showed a white customer being warmly greeted and escorted inside. There was no audio, but the message didn't need words. The video hit social media like a spark in dry grass. Views multiplied by the hour. Hashtags began trending. Activists, journalists, influencers, they all wanted a comment. Phones at headquarters rang nonstop. Emails flooded in, and among the chaos, whispers started among the staff. Some were horrified, others defensive. A few saw it as vindication. But everyone agreed. Something big was about to happen. Marcus called an emergency town hall meeting for the next morning and extended the invite to the press. He was done waiting, done handling things behind closed doors. He spent the night reviewing statements, preparing to speak not just to his employees, but to the public. He wanted to tell the truth. He had built Hayes Motors on the idea that success should be earned, not inherited, and certainly never bought with prejudice. If that meant tearing down part of the structure to rebuild it right, so be it. But just before the meeting, his assistant walked in, holding a tablet and a printed legal memo. Face pale. "They don't want you speaking," she said quietly. Marcus looked up from his notes. "Who doesn't?" "The company's legal team. They said you'll violate confidentiality agreements if you name anyone or reference internal policy documents. They've already prepared a statement for you, one that avoids blame." She placed the memo in front of him. He didn't touch it. "And if I don't read it?" he asked. Her eyes flickered with concern. "They said you could be in breach of contract. There's a clause, something about reputational risk. They might sue. You could lose your seat on the board." Marcus leaned back in his chair. The meeting room was quiet except for the soft hum of the lights. He glanced at the statement on the table, sterile, generic, lifeless. For the first time, it hit him not as frustration or disappointment, but as betrayal. The company he had built was trying to silence him. Not the world outside, his own. The early morning sky was overcast, casting a dull light across Marcus's private office. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner, familiar, but not comforting. He sat at the end of a long mahogany table, surrounded by faces he hadn't brought together in years. These were the people he once leaned on when Hayes Motors was just an idea. And now, years later, they sat again, this time not as architects of growth, but as defenders in a looming battle. To his left was Yvonne Clark, resolute as ever, her notepad already filled with scribbles. Across from her, a man in a navy turtleneck and glasses, Alan Breen, former communications director turned media consultant. Beside him sat Alicia Vance, a civil rights attorney who'd once worked alongside Marcus on a corporate diversity initiative that had stalled when William took over operations. Marcus didn't waste time. "They want me quiet," he said flatly, "and they're ready to push me out if I talk." Alicia leaned forward, flipping through a printed copy of the founding agreement. Her fingers paused at the bottom of page 7. "Right here," she said, tapping the page. "Operational discretion clause. William was granted temporary authority over internal policy, but only with sign-off from at least 2 other directors. That includes HR and finance. Yvonne raised an eyebrow. And if those two are loyal to him? Then that authority becomes functionally absolute. Alicia said. Until someone challenges it. Alan chimed in. You're being boxed in from the inside while they spin the outside. That viral video worked in your favor for about 12 hours. Now the story's shifting. Headlines are starting to question your leadership. Stocks dipped this morning. That's fuel for a board vote. Marcus rubbed his temple. We need leverage, something that flips the focus back where it belongs. Alicia folded her hands. If we can prove those guidelines are part of a pattern of systemic discrimination, not just isolated errors, we can bring federal pressure. But we'll need more than policy language. We need intent, internal knowledge, and ideally, a witness from the top. Yvonne crossed her arms. What about Susan Lin? Marcus's head lifted slightly. I thought about her. She was head of training and ethics for 6 years. Left last spring. Said it was personal. It wasn't, Yvonne said. I spoke with her after she left. She was tired of fighting uphill. She didn't say it outright. But it was clear she didn't agree with how things were being run. Marcus stood and walked toward the window. Then I'll reach out. Back at his desk later that afternoon, Marcus drafted an email. He hesitated for a long moment before hitting send, unsure if Susan would even respond, or worse, if she was already being pressured to stay quiet. Meanwhile, the news cycle turned sharper. A business blog ran a headline that read, Hayes CEO accused of breaching internal trust. Another segment on financial television speculated whether the board was planning a formal review of his conduct. The speculation alone shaved 2% off the company's stock by the time markets closed. Marcus read the reports silently. He didn't call his PR team. He didn't issue a statement. He waited. That evening, just past 9 p.m., his inbox pinged with a message. No sender name, just a blank subject line and a file attachment. The email body read, You should know what they said before this started. The attached file was an audio recording. He hesitated a beat, then pressed play. Tom's voice came through first, recognizable. Nervous. Some of these folks just don't fit our brand. I mean, let's be honest, it's not a good look. Then William's voice followed, calm and clipped. I'm not saying refuse them outright. Just guide the right ones through. The others, make them wait. Let the front desk handle it. They'll get the message. There was silence, then a soft chuckle. Besides, William added, the fewer complaints, the cleaner our image. Marcus's grip tightened around the phone. The recording ended. He stared at the screen, reading the anonymous email again. No name, no trace. Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were doing. It was a loaded weapon, but one that came with risk. Using it publicly without authentication could backfire. It could be dismissed as edited, planted, or worse, an illegal wiretap. He forwarded the file to Yvonne and Alicia, then leaned back in his chair. It wasn't just about policy anymore. Now he had a glimpse behind the curtain. But pulling it open might cost more than just his title. Marcus sat alone in his den late into the night. The soft hum of the air conditioning his only company. The recording weighed on him like a stone in his chest. It wasn't just the content, it was the uncertainty. Who sent it? Why now? Could it be a trap? Every instinct told him to be cautious. This wasn't just about exposure, it was about survival. By morning, he made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Raymond Davis picked up after the second ring. His voice was deeper than Marcus remembered. Rough around the edges but alert. You're calling because things have gotten messy, Raymond said before Marcus could even explain. Marcus let out a dry chuckle. You always did know when the fan was spinning. Raymond agreed to meet him that afternoon at a quiet, unmarked office space on the edge of the city. Once the company's head of IT, Raymond had been one of Marcus's earliest hires. They built the infrastructure of Hayes Motors side by side, before Raymond quietly stepped down due to health issues and internal politics he didn't want to play. I need you to trace this, Marcus said, sliding over a printed copy of the email headers and the raw audio file. Raymond nodded without asking further questions. His fingers danced across the keyboard with the familiarity of an old pianist returning to his bench. 40 minutes later, he looked up. It came from inside, he said, not corporate HQ, but from a residential network. Cross-referencing the login ID attached to the encrypted tunnel. I'd bet money on Carla Voss. Marcus's brow furrowed. The name was familiar. She was William's scheduling assistant. Wasn't she? Was. Raymond confirmed. She's been on extended medical leave. No indication she's coming back. Marcus stared at the screen. Carla had always seemed quiet, even nervous, the kind of person who kept her head down and her mouth shut. If she'd sent this, something must have changed. He didn't wait. That same evening, he drove alone to a modest house in a quiet suburb just outside the city. The lawn was neatly kept, the blinds drawn. He rang the bell twice before the door opened. Carla stood there in sweatpants and a loose sweater, her eyes wide, face pale. "Mr. Hayes," she said in a half-whisper. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said gently. "I just want to talk. 5 minutes. That's all." She hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the living room was modest. A stack of unopened mail sat on a side table. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea neither of them would drink. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," she admitted. "I almost didn't," Marcus replied. "But what you sent me, it matters. And I need to know if there's more." Carla sat down across from him. Her eyes darted to the door, the windows, then back to him. "I kept my head down for years. I told myself it wasn't my place. But the last few months, watching what they were doing, I couldn't sit with it anymore." Marcus leaned in slightly. "What exactly did you see?" She pulled out a small black drive from a folder on the coffee table. "I copied everything I could before I left. William ordered the deletion of complaint emails, especially ones that mentioned race or bias. He told me to clean the inbox so it wouldn't show up in audits." She swallowed. He didn't say it outright, but it was always the same kind of customer. He called them low impact, said they wouldn't buy, just waste time, said it hurt our brand to have them sitting in the showroom. Marcus took the drive carefully. This is enough to move forward." Carla nodded, but her voice was quieter now. "If they find out it came from me." "They won't," Marcus promised. "And if anything happens, I'll make sure you're protected." He left her home feeling both heavy and determined. The drive in his pocket could be the turning point, but only if used wisely. Back in the corporate tower, William wasn't wasting time. That same day, he stood at the head of a long polished table in the boardroom. His voice was steady, confident. "Marcus has lost perspective," he said, his tone practiced. "He's risking everything we've built, alienating partners, dividing staff. He's made this personal, and now the media is running wild." Some board members nodded, others exchanged glances. William leaned forward. "We need to consider the company's future, with or without him." Meanwhile, in Marcus's office, Raymond returned with a warning. "I traced a data packet that went out from this floor yesterday," he said, "encrypted, routed through 3 proxy servers. But it originated from inside your advisory group." Marcus's breath caught. "Someone in my circle?" Raymond nodded. "Someone's been feeding William updates. Your meetings, your emails, not everything, but enough." Marcus stood still, hands behind his back, looking out the window as the city lights flickered on. He thought of Carla, of the drive in his pocket, of William standing in that boardroom with the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. He didn't speak for a long time, but when he turned around, the fire in his eyes had returned. The auditorium inside Hayes Motors headquarters had never felt so tight, so electric. Rows of chairs were lined up in perfect symmetry. Large screens stood on both sides of the stage, humming with static as the IT crew finalized the audiovisual setup. A faint murmur of conversation filled the air. Journalists in navy suits tapped away at their laptops, while investors and employees murmured quietly, their eyes darting toward the closed stage door. Behind that door, Marcus Hayes stood by himself. He wore a charcoal suit, classic but not loud, and his tie was pinned just slightly off-center, as if to say he hadn't come to perform but to speak. The tension in his shoulders was visible, but his breath was steady. He glanced at the small notepad in his hand, filled not with a speech but reminders, names, dates, truths that had nearly been erased. Across the room, William Dresner stood in his own corner of the chaos, flanked by 2 legal advisors and a corporate spokesperson. He looked polished, confident, as if he were walking into a quarterly report rather than a reckoning. He adjusted his cufflinks and whispered something inaudible to the woman beside him. She nodded and handed him a folder marked, Defense 01. As the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the crowd. Marcus stepped forward and stood at the center of the stage. The microphone didn't need to be tapped, it picked up the breath before his first word. Good afternoon, he began. I didn't call this meeting as a CEO. I called it as a man who believes in the company we built. A company that, somewhere along the way, lost part of its soul. There was no slideshow, no music, just a deep breath and a quiet nod to the tech team. The screen behind him lit up with surveillance footage. No fancy editing, just raw clips from the dealership, one after another, showing black and brown customers being ignored, turned away, or quietly judged from behind desks. Each clip more uncomfortable than the last. The audio was clear, painful. We're just really full today, maybe try next week, one employee said while a white customer was being offered coffee 2 feet away. Then came the documents, emails between William and senior staff. Phrases highlighted in yellow. Focus on high-value demographics. Discourage non-aligned profiles without confrontation. As the final image faded, Marcus turned back to the audience. This isn't just a staffing issue. It's not a bad apple. This was policy, hidden in language, dressed in business logic. But make no mistake, it was discrimination. William stood. With all due respect, he said, his voice controlled but sharp. These decisions were not mine alone. These were board-approved protocols designed to protect the brand. I implemented what was collectively decided. He motioned to the legal team, who handed him a printed email chain. In fact, he continued, Marcus was aware of these frameworks months ago. Here's an email where he acknowledges the operational direction and gives no objection. Gasps rippled through the room. Marcus didn't blink. Let's talk about that email, he said, voice calm. Because I've never seen that version before. He turned toward the back of the auditorium. Just as the doors opened, Susan Lin stepped into the room. She walked with quiet confidence. Her silver hair tied back. Her posture upright. She'd once led the HR division during some of the company's fastest growth years before suddenly resigning without explanation. Many assumed health. Others guessed burnout. Now they knew. I kept a copy, she said, her voice carrying across the room like a judge's gavel, of the original email Marcus sent. I have it here. She held up a USB drive. I was asked to delete this and forward an edited version. I didn't, because I knew one day, someone would need to hear the truth. The screen flashed again. A comparison. The altered email Marcus supposedly wrote, vague, passive, versus the original. A clear rejection of the classification system and a call for an inclusive policy review. William's face tightened, but Susan wasn't done. There's more, she said. She handed another drive to the tech team. What followed wasn't footage or spreadsheets. It was William's voice, recorded on a quiet afternoon in a strategy session over a year ago. We can't have those people lingering in the lounge. It sends the wrong message. Low conversion, high image risk. You need to steer them out without a scene. Make them uncomfortable if you have to. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the reporters stopped typing. The only sound was the hiss of the speaker system, and William's own words echoing through it, slowly dissolving into nothing. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stepped back, hands folded in front of him. As the weight of truth did its job, the room remained frozen long after Susan's recording ended. The last few seconds of William's voice, sharp, dismissive, and unmistakably real, still echoed in people's ears like a wound that refused to close. No one moved, no one spoke. The weight of that audio seemed to stretch time itself. On the front row, a few shareholders sat stiffly upright, exchanging glances that said more than any official vote could. One woman, whose firm controlled nearly 8% of the company's stock, slowly slid her notepad into her bag and folded her arms. Another, a longtime supporter of William, quietly pushed his chair back and stepped out, his phone already pressed to his ear. The journalists didn't wait for official permission. Within minutes, headlines began flashing across phone screens and news tickers. Hayes Motors implodes over discrimination scandal. CEO vindicated after damning audio released. Top executive calls black customers brand risk. William stood frozen near the side of the stage, jaw clenched tight. He adjusted his tie, but it no longer sat right. His voice, when he finally spoke, had lost its earlier confidence. "This recording," he said, "is clearly doctored, taken out of context, edited. This is character assassination by disgruntled ex-employees." He pointed toward Susan, who remained seated near the press section. Calm and collected, she was passed over for a board position 3 years ago. Her motives are personal. But no one clapped, no one nodded. Instead, all eyes turned to Marcus as he stepped back to the microphone. "Personal motives don't erase facts," he said, "and neither do threats. We've verified this audio independently. And what's worse, it's consistent with patterns we've now confirmed through documents, client complaints, and, let's be honest, our own silence." He clicked to the next slide on the screen, displaying emails from Carla, notes from Eric, and internal logs that had been buried under layers of permissions. The evidence was overwhelming. William's grip on the room was dissolving with each passing second. Sensing the shift, William pivoted. "In light of the current media frenzy," he said, with a rehearsed calmness, "I will temporarily step down from my position and fully cooperate with the independent review process." He held the pause just long enough to seem generous. Then added, "This company is bigger than any one of us. I believe in its future." His smile was thin, a calculated move. The message to his allies in the room was clear. This isn't over. But behind the curtain, it was already crumbling. After the session ended, the room emptied in waves. The press scrambled to broadcast soundbites. Staff members whispered in the hallways. A few clapped Marcus on the back as they passed, murmuring quiet thanks, but he barely acknowledged them. His shoulders sagged slightly as he walked through the back corridor. Alone with his thoughts, back in his office, he sank into the leather chair he once picked out with pride. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to sit in silence. It wasn't over. He knew that. When Eric knocked gently on the door, Marcus looked up. The young man still looked uncertain in his new role, his hands fidgeting slightly even in a crisp shirt and company pin. "I just wanted to thank you," Eric said, "and let you know I'm ready to do whatever it takes. I've got ideas, not just policies, real changes." Marcus stood and walked around the desk. He put a hand on Eric's shoulder. "Then let's get to work. You're not here to sit quietly anymore." Eric's eyes brightened, not with pride, but with responsibility. Later that evening, as the office lights dimmed and the building quieted down, Raymond walked in holding a small folder marked, "For Marcus only." He handed it over without a word. Inside was a security briefing. One section was highlighted in red. A PR firm, Corvan Strategies, had been working off the books with someone inside the board. Not William, someone still at the table. They had coordinated messaging, language for the customer segmentation policy, and suppression strategies for whistleblower complaints. A second name sat underlined in bold. One Marcus had never questioned. One who had stood beside him during the company's founding years. William wasn't the architect. He was a gatekeeper, and the real architect was still inside. Marcus closed the folder. His face didn't show anger, just resolve, the kind of quiet, cold clarity a man finds when he knows the war is deeper than the battle he just won. He turned off the light. Tomorrow would not be a day of rest. The company-wide meeting began just past noon. Broadcast live across every Hayes Motors location in the country. Screens flickered on in showrooms from Atlanta to Seattle. Break rooms were packed, and conference lines buzzed as thousands of employees, from managers to mechanics, waited in silence. At the center of the company's headquarters, in a room usually reserved for quarterly forecasts and shareholder applause, Marcus stood behind a podium with no script in front of him. No teleprompter, just his voice, steady and clear. "I owe every single one of you an apology," he began, "not because I didn't know something was broken, but because I didn't look deep enough to see how broken it really was." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "For years, we talked about values, about excellence, about trust, but somewhere along the line, we let that trust become a mirror, only reflecting who we liked seeing. We judged people by the cut of their jacket, the sound of their voice, or the shade of their skin. That ends today." There was no applause, not yet, just silence, full of attention. Marcus went on to lay out a sweeping reform plan. A complete cultural audit would begin immediately. conducted by an external civil rights advisory board. A new customer advocacy division would be formed, independent of the sales chain. An anonymous reporting system would be implemented company-wide, monitored by a third-party nonprofit watchdog. These changes, Marcus said, aren't meant to make us look better. They're meant to make us be better. He turned and gestured toward two figures seated behind him. First, Susan Lin, calm, composed, and returning not as a whistleblower but as a senior advisor, charged with leading cultural transformation from the inside. Then, Eric, still a bit stiff in his pressed shirt but holding his head higher than ever before. Marcus introduced him as a member of the new Operational Integrity Council, representing frontline staff. The camera cut to Eric, who gave a small nod. He didn't smile. He wasn't here for a celebration. He was here to work. As the feed ended, applause finally came, not thunderous, not theatrical, but steady, real. Over the following weeks, headlines change. Hayes Motors faces itself. Cultural reckoning turns into corporate rebirth. CEO Marcus D. Hayes rebuilds from within. Williams' fate unfolded quickly. After weeks of formal review, federal regulators opened investigations into data suppression and discrimination. Emails, recordings, and altered policies formed a damning paper trail. Former allies distanced themselves. Lawsuits were filed, and as Marcus had once suspected, William wasn't acting alone. But that truth, too, would take time to surface. In the meantime, the company's stock began climbing again. Customers who once swore they'd never return sent letters. Not just about the reforms, but about finally being seen. One evening, Marcus sat down with a news anchor for a one-on-one interview. Cameras rolling, lights soft but focused. She asked the question everyone was still thinking. How does it feel to win? He leaned back, hands folded loosely in his lap. I didn't win because I'm CEO. He said, I won because I've been that man people looked through. I've been the kid people ignored in a waiting room. I've been the man asked to wait outside while someone else got served. That doesn't go away. It becomes part of your skin, part of your walk, part of how you fight. There was a stillness in the studio after he spoke. Not silence, stillness. After the interview, Marcus returned to his office. Exhausted but steady. The building was quiet, most staff gone for the night. He opened his door, expecting the usual dim lighting, the quiet hum of the city through the window. Instead, he saw an envelope. It sat neatly in the center of his desk. No name, no logo, just thick ivory paper, folded with care. He opened it slowly. Inside was a photocopy of a contract, old, faded, but unmistakable. It was from the company's earliest days, with the signatures of all three original founders, Marcus, William, and the third. At the bottom of the page, scribbled in blue ink, was a single line. This goes deeper than you know. Meet me, alone. Marcus read it twice. Then again. He turned the paper over. Nothing else. Outside, the city glowed with the confidence of closure. But Marcus knew better. The story wasn't over. It had only just reached the part that mattered most. At the end of the day, this wasn't just about a car dealership. It was about how deeply bias can hide behind polite smiles and polished floors. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice to expose the truth. He simply let their actions speak for themselves. So here's the question. How many people are judged not by who they are, but by what they wear, or the color of their skin? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to Undercover Truths for more real-life moments that reveal what happens when the hidden becomes visible. Your voice matters, and so does your click.